data analyst skills in the work that I do. You know, we need a lot of AI-based analytics in human rights as well, and I do use them. So that is just to answer your question. And just to tie up, you know, some of the discussions that we've had in the morning, I really like the term that Brett Chapman used, sorted stories. All our history books are full of sorted stories of what really happened, you know, during the colonized periods, whether in India, whether in the Americas, and, you know, in various parts of the Asian continent, Africa, everywhere. So it's great to revisit, to write our own stories, because I think I just read a quote recently which said that until the lion learns how to write, every story is going to glorify the hunter. So this is our attempt to be the lions who can write our own story and tell the world what really happened. And my topic today is the Bengal Famine. Bengal is a state in India, and it's just a small part of India. And so I'll be able to advance this, right? Yes. So you know, this presentation has many stark pictures, but I felt I was debating whether to add the pictures or not. And you know, a picture speaks 1,000 words. So I felt like without the pictures, my story is going to be incomplete. They can be disturbing, but we need to have a collective memory of what really happened in those times which have been forgotten because we have only been hearing sorted stories so far. So we are sort of investigating the colonial culpability during the 1943-44 Bengal famine, which was actually excused as a famine that happened because of the World War II. And you know, I want to just sort of introduce what happened in India in the context of just the whole process of Indian colonization through Islamic invaders, when we could see the mountains of skulls that were there for everybody to see, and the terror that it happened during those times was well documented. But the British colonialists adopted many surreptitious methods, corrosive practices to subjugate and annihilate the local wealth, and through stealthy exploitation strategies and legal measures. India was one of the richest countries in the world. It had a 33% GDP share. And by the time the British left, it was less than 2% of the world's GDP. It was an industrial export-led economy, and it became an agricultural economy as, you know, the people were deprived of their livelihoods, their textile looms were broken, their ships were taken away, everything was made illegal, and only the British goods were imported. You know, even when there was no rain, or there were no crops, or there was famines, which became in a country that was very rich and monsoons had 4 crop rotational, you know, agricultural cycles where there were 3 to 4 harvests in most parts of India. Famines became a commonplace occurrence in India during the colonial rule. And there was no let-up in the collection of taxes and revenue, as one of the collectors once told the viceroy that, you know, there is no food for people to eat, and there's only grass in the fields. And the viceroy said, well, grass is a good commodity, and you should be able to meet your targets. So the revenue in the British rule, the British revenue only kept growing, even though people kept starving. And these are just pictures of, you know, some of the people whose homes got lost, whose health deteriorated, and malnutrition was a commonplace occurrence. And this is why Mahatma Gandhi actually adopted the method of fasting, and also of, you know, wearing these sparse clothes. So before I go into the 1943 famine, which was the last famine in the British rule, I wanted to just take us through what I just said that happened during the British rule. There were commonplace famines every single year, And the death toll of what happened during the British rule is for all to see over here, right? So as soon as the British won the Battle of Plassey in like 1767, in a couple of years, they were able to immediately engineer the Great Bengal Famine, which was something very new, and 10 million people lost their lives. As they kept expanding, Bengal was the first state in which they came. As they kept expanding towards the northern India, towards the Madras, the famines in all these places kept occurring, one by one. And as you can see, the death toll, there was more than 100 million people who died by the time the last famine that we are going to discuss actually took place, And in 1830, if you just see that, there was also slave trade, that happened between, when Africa, when the slave trade in Africa, there was a lull there. A lot of people were taken from India as slaves, and they were captured and taken there. And those things are not documented. Those are other things that we need to document properly. And as Suthars has already pointed out, the Mopla genocide and all other things. I know there was one more thing that I wanted to point out, but these are just important facts to note, that India went through a lot of genociding, engineered famines that were engineered with precision by the British. I wanted to go through what are the main features of the Bengal famine, because while the excuses that were made were that the background war was important, a cyclone happened, the Japanese had invaded Burma, so we could not import rice, and so people were dying like flies. What really happened was actually a stark, calculated cruelty that was perpetrated on the Bengali people. It was a year of a good crop. There was a good harvest. It was a year of good rain. So there was no reason for shortage, despite the war. But the colonial rulers followed a two-pronged strategy of denial and scorched earth policy. And their excuse was that the Japanese are going to invade, so we want to make sure that they don't lay hands on any of the rice or any of the transportation. So there were two parts. There was a rice denial. So all of the rice from the countryside, the villages where most of the harvest used to take place, or the crops used to be grown, was brought into Calcutta. And it was stocked and stored and stockpiled for, saying it's for the labor force, because Calcutta was the hub of all, war industrial production also. So 1 million workers were working in Calcutta at that time. Also, they had the army cantonments, right? So they needed rice for that. But literally, they looted out, took out all of the rice from the villagers. The villagers in India always resisted. They would come out, they would try to steal it from the lorry, they would take their lathis and try to charge and take back, because they knew that this meant, they knew what was going on, obviously. But they were treated with absolute cruelty. All of their, either they were gunned down, and so the fear of resistance was also put in them, and they would be killed in cold blood, simply because they were angry that their rations were being taken away. The second thing was the boat denial. It's a very rural area. Also, it is a very wetland area. River transportation was important. And about 66,000 boats were seized and taken away. And again, Japanese invasion was an excuse. But because of that, people, their bullock carts were taken away also. So people could not transport between villages. They had to walk. As I've shown this picture, they're walking with their belongings from the village to Calcutta. And, they're sitting in the streets of Calcutta begging for food. And this was literally the kind of situation that actually happened to a lot of people. They died on the streets. So because of boat denial, fishermen could not fish, And so basically every single morsel that fish is an important staple diet rice is an important staple diet. So what happened to the Native Americans, like the bison were killed, and in the mountains of bisons were killed, right, and completely decimating the population because that was a staple. Something similar happened here in Bengal during the famine. And, ICHRRF actually was one of the first people to throw light on this, and he actually did say that how different was the Holocaust compared to what happened at the Bengal famine. And that is why I'm sorry to put this stark picture, but these are the kinds of pictures you see everywhere when you start to research on the Bengal famine. And that's Winston Churchill. And as ICHRRF said, Churchill also killed the Bengalis in cold blood. And I want to just read out some of the important information here. Churchill, first of all, was an expert at blockading, which he did in Germany in World War I to bring it down to its knees, which meant denying the people their staple foods. And this is exactly what happened in Bengal as well. The same skill was used in the name of blockading the Japanese, but what actually turned out was they were blockading the innocent civilians of India. An efficient and good program was instead developed in Britain, and in Britain, the nutritional diet was ensured through rations to every citizen, to children, juices were given, and so the British health indicators were much better than before the war, World War II. So there was an absolute stark difference of how the British citizen was treated in England versus how the Indian citizen were treated in India. So I know I had some quotes from Churchill, but I'm a little bit messed up with my paperwork. The other important thing that I wanted to point out was that there was also a cloth famine, which is why people are not wearing clothes. Most of the people were wearing very sparse clothes because the rice not only was taken away from the villages, but also with the rice traders, the rice mills, everybody was given, the rice was taken away from everybody. So they would, instead of asking them to cooperate, there would be surprise seizures, and rice was taken away from the traders as well. And the important thing to note is that when Japan actually did arrive in Calcutta, it bombed Calcutta, and all of the coolies and the industrial laborers, like I said, 1 million who were working there were Indians, and they were all, a lot of them were killed. And their corpses lay in the streets like you see here, and in the first picture on the top. And nothing was done. Just as the villagers who came in and who were destitute, who were sitting in the streets and dying like flies, and the vultures and jackals would come and eat the corpses, half-eaten corpses lay in the streets. Similarly, these people were also left to die without proper ceremonial cremation. And what were the British focused there on? Instead of focusing on medical supplies for the wounded or taking care of the dead, a grand charity ball was supposed to take place in New Delhi when Stafford Cripps was arriving in March 1942. And it was almost like a Marie Antoinette moment, but it was averted because the Times reporter told them that there's going to be a massive demonstration if there is a charity ball organized. And so they were able to withdraw. Gandhi actually wrote in his magazine, Harijan, that the boat denial and rice denial are unjustified, and so he was imprisoned at that time. And large tracts of rich fertile land could have been used to grow rice. At that time, rice is a staple, like I said, 80% of the diet in Bengal. And they have at least 3 crops grown every year. But a lot of those lands were given away to make, for army encampments, for aerodromes and warehousing of the stockpiled rice. So a lot of that also, rice could not be grown in that area for as long as that war was going on. So there were obviously some relief and some relief work was being done, but again, it was never enough. These are the lines in the soup kitchen, and the soup kitchen again was not managed very well. And hence what happened was that people sometimes, because they were so famine deprived, that some of the food that they were served, like sometimes when bajra or millet would be served, people would be dying again due to the shock to their systems because they were not used to that sort of a diet. So these people sometimes, the lines would be so long that people would die while they were waiting for the food. And, there was absolutely no care in terms of medicines and, taking care of the ill in a proper manner. So this is definitely the colonial legacy of terror and neglect. A famine commission was actually set up, right? And people were being brought from the villages to these city camps. I was talking about the camp here that we are seeing here. And like I said, they died, and the corpses were left to rot in the streets or in the camps. And death thus became a public spectacle, and 1943 was the year of the corpse, a ubiquitous and material fact of Bengal. 1944, on the other hand, was declared as the end of the famine. And when reporters came to write, and they told their stories, they could see that there was stark hunger and starvation still happening. As Amartya Sen said, while 7 to 10 million people died and the record stayed 3 million, what actually happened is that most of the people died after the famine also because of the onset of lots of health issues and diseases. Because famines don't just happen suddenly, There is the silent violence of malnutrition that precedes and conditions and debilitation and disease. And that was pointed out by social scientists as early as 1934. Satish Chandra Mittal had noted this, that there are lots of hungry and starving people. And as I showed that list of famines, that is why I wanted to show that list, because it had a direct impact on this famine of 1943 and 44. So I think in conclusion, I just want to say that Indians, Indians have suffered as much as the Africans when there was slave trade, maybe not in that many number, but a lot of Indian people were taken from India to slave in, rubber plantations or, plantations in the Caribbeans and, taken in as slave trade. As you saw, I don't know how the Holocaust was any different compared to how these 7, 8 million people, 10 million even by certain records, died in Bengal. How was it any different? 100 million people died. So as one of the students from George Washington here, Emma Penderson, just told me, it's like, why is it that we discuss only one genocide all the time, the Jewish Holocaust? Why don't we discuss these genocides? So I really want to thank Adityanji and the team at ICHRRF for organizing this, because it is a painful memory for us to relive, but it is a collective memory that our generations in future and the current generation should not forget. We have to leave these sordid stories to the trash bin and start telling our real stories and be the real lions that we are. And it is our collective duty to do this, and I'm really glad to be and honored to be part of this discussion and to present here, and I do want to salute the spirit of the brave people of the undivided Bengal who survived several attempts at annihilation, slavery, and Holocaust. The famine only ended because the Bengal thankfully delivered a strong rice harvest by 1944. And like the British during the Irish potato famine, the British again refused to allow import or replacement foods during the 2 years that this famine occurred. I wanted to also just quickly go over some of the excuses that were made and how, if you look at any of the colonized countries, you find a high level of bureaucracy and corruption in all of these because it was implanted by the colonialists, right? And the kind of theories that were created, first of all, they made excuses, like Lord Bheel and other viceroy and the other people. They said that there's no use going into the dissection of why this famine happened and why so many people died. And yet, of course, the Indian, the Gandhi and others, they were adamant. And the inquiry commission actually came up with these weird theories of, food availability decline theory, and, so a lot of theoretical failure of exchange entitlement theory, a lot of theoretical messaging right there. And of course, what Churchill said, that, Indians are a beastly population with a beastly religion, the Malthusian concept of too much of population was also used to explain out this whole concept. So, again, the divisive theories were also used. The rich versus the poor, the caste theory was also used, and all of the warnings that came up through social scientists, through the chief finance minister, Fazl-ul-Haq, were all disregarded. So in the end, I think what recently, in 2000s, there were other analyses, because there is decolonial, understanding of history happening. And this is my last message, but there is a certain, did I lose the mic? I think it's good. So yeah, this is the last message, that there was obviously a certain level of racism, a high level of racism rather, which otherized the Indian population, which is why their health suffered so badly during these times of colonization, right? That the fact that the white race there was a supremacy to the white race versus the others, and that their deaths did not matter, is a very important factor why we don't even discuss these genocides in the current context. In the United Nations, they are not well represented. Indigenous peoples are not well represented in current human rights organizations, mainstream organizations either. So I think those are important points that I just wanted to make in regard to this famine, and also the overall condition of what's going on for us as indigenous people, and why we need to start raising our voice to make sure our collective memory remains intact and that we rewrite the colonial history into our own language and vocabulary. Thank you so much.